We're going to move on to our third and final speaker. Mr. Mark Tomey is a native of Marlton, Arkansas, where he graduated from high school in 1978. He attended the University of Arkansas, obtaining a BS in civil engineering in 1983. After 13 years as someone else's employee, he established his own consulting firm, Structural Engineering, and has subsequently been enjoying both the headaches and rewards of owning his own business. His firm services clients in the architectural, metal building systems, pulp and paper, chemical manufacturing, and wood products industries. Mark has been a member of the League of the South since 1996, and he currently serves on the League's board of directors. He has been a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans since 1997 and served 2 terms as commander of his camp in Monroe, Louisiana. He has also been a part of the Southern National Congress since its inception in 2007, where he is currently serving as Vice Chairman of the Congress and Chairman of the SNC Constitution Committee. Mark and his wife, Marguerite, live near Bluntsville, Alabama, and are the proud owners of a 21-acre farm which they named Terrebonne in honor of their French ancestry and the Louisiana parish where Marguerite was born. They have 3 sons and 3 granddaughters, and a 4th grandchild, their first grandson, due in late September. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mark Tomey.
I feel kind of low tech up here today with Mr. Singh and Michael's nice PowerPoint presentations and everything here, and I'm doing mine now off of just old-fashioned paper notes here. But I want to thank Mike Tubbs and Steve and all the folks of the Florida League for being so gracious as to invite me to come back here and speak to you again. I was here a couple of years ago and I really enjoyed being here, and so it's always an honor and a privilege to be here in Florida with the good folks of the Florida League. The topic that I'm going to talk about today is about the League of the South itself. Not so much about the organizational structure and things like that, but the principles that we believe in, why we believe in them, why we're advancing them, and why we think it's important for you to be a part of the League of the South to help us do all that. And I guess the easiest way to start off with is to restate, for those of you who are League members, what the League's statement of purpose is, which is to advance the cultural, social, economic, and political well-being and independence of the Southern people by all honorable means. Now, in today's scientific age, everybody wants to try to compartmentalize things and break stuff down into their smallest components. And as an engineer, you know, I understand that because I deal with that kind of thing on a daily basis in my business. But when you're talking about cultural, social, economic, and political issues, these things are all intricately interwoven with one another. And at bottom, culture is what all of the others derive from and flow out of, because it's our culture, the things that we believe in, the worldview that we possess, the religious beliefs that we have, that all make up what that cultus, from the Latin word for our English word culture, is all about. And so it naturally flows that social ideas, economic ideas, and political ideas flow out of that cultural base. So I'm not going to try to be too specific on a lot of these things. There's going to be a lot of overlap as we go through these things today. Now, it looks like the 2 previous speakers have already run off the faint of heart, so maybe I don't necessarily have to make this qualifying explanation here at the start, but I will anyway, for the courtesy of any that may still be in the room. And I think it's important for us to define a couple of terms in order to be able to make the contrast between what I'm going to be talking about. We have to have some basis of comparison between ourselves and all the others. As Michael said, that's something else. And so, so let me start off by saying that you're going to hear me use the term Yankee. And I'm probably going to use it a lot. But I'll qualify it just slightly by saying that my experience in life has shown me that not all Northerners are Yankees. Okay?
I'm going to leave now.
Exactly. By the same token, not all people born and raised in the South are Southerners either. An accident of birth and a geographical location do not determine what you are and who you are. It's what you think up here, it's what you believe in here, it's how you view the world, and it's how you live your life. So if we strictly stuck with the accident of birth and geography definition, my good friend Al Benson Jr. from Louisiana, or who lives in Louisiana, who's originally from either Rhode Island or Massachusetts, I believe, could not be considered a Southerner. But you will not find a better, more dedicated Confederate Southerner than Al Benson Jr., even though he says yad and kai. By the same token, if accident of birth and geography were the criteria, Bill Clinton is a Southerner. And I don't think there's a person in this room that's willing to accept Bill Clinton into the pantheon of Southerners. So, with that put to rest, well, let me proceed on here. So, and start off by asking, why not independence for Dixie? Why not? As Michael Tubbs mentioned in his comments, and Michael Cushman as well, it's wonderful to me listening to these other folks to see how God works with what we're doing and talking about here, because so many things that I've got, parts of them you've already heard, so I hope I don't bore you to death with it by repeating it to a certain degree. But the dissolution of larger artificial nation states into smaller, more homogeneous ones is, in fact, the way that the historical pendulum is swinging today. If you were to take a look at a world map that was published 30 years ago, you would see countries listed on that map that no longer exist today. By the same token, you would also see countries that didn't exist then that populate that map to a great degree today. And I want to share a quick anecdote with you in that regard. Several years ago, my wife and I took a vacation to Savannah and Charleston. And while we were in Charleston, we were staying in a bed and breakfast downtown, an old renovated plantation home. And every morning they would fix breakfast for everybody that was staying there, and we would all get together in the nice formal dining room and sit around a great big beautiful oak table and eat breakfast and discuss things with one another. One of the other couples that were staying there were also on vacation. It was a diplomat and his wife from the Czech Republic. And every morning he and I would get into historical and geopolitical discussions about things. And since we were in Charleston, and naturally the conversation got steered toward the War for Southern Independence and things that happened in Charleston, and of course all of the political background for the war and so forth. And during the course of our conversations, he told me one time, he said, you know, I really appreciate the conversation and what you're saying, but he said, you know, back where I come from, most of my contemporaries take the side of the North in the War for Southern Independence. And I kind of leaned back a little bit, and then I leaned back forward, and I said, well, you know, I find that very interesting, seeing as how your country was born out of following the Southern principle from that war. Because the Czech Republic is the result of the division of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. And he didn't really say much to that, and we went our separate ways for the day. The next morning we got together for breakfast, and he said that, well, you know, we're on our way back home after today. But he said, you know, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. And when I go back home to Prague, I'm going to tell all of my friends there that we've been looking at this the wrong way. So the Southern principle is the principle of the future: secession and devolution. In his 1957 essay, The South and the American Union, Richard Weaver commented that at that time, with the United States government advocating for secession for all these different countries in different parts of the world, that it was very handsome of the South that it did not raise the question of its own independence again at that time. And from the standpoint of the League, and those of us here today, my only response to that could be is that, well, it's time for the South to stop being handsome and get ugly. It's time for us to raise the question of our independence once again. And not just raise the question, but work to make it happen. Now, why are some of the reasons why the League believes that the South should have its own separate cultural, social, economic, and political existence apart from the other that makes up the rest of whatever the United States of America is today? Well, let me start off again with another anecdote. A good friend of mine back in Louisiana was telling me the story, and this is in relation to not necessarily to Yankees, but it was in relation to black folks. His grandfather, when he was a boy about 11 or 12 years old, he said he was helping his grandfather on his farm there in the Delta of Louisiana, and he had some fellows working for him there, and he gathered them around and gave them instructions for everything he wanted each of them to do that day. And one fellow in particular was supposed to get on the tractor and go plow one particular area. But he told him, he said, now, when you're going by the big pecan tree down there, be sure and steer nice and clear of it, because there's a sinkhole opening up around the base of that pecan tree. If you get too close, you're going to get the tractor off in it. So they all went off to do their various tasks, and my friend said he stood there with his grandfather, and they watched them all go off in the various directions. The fellow he'd told to get on the tractor got up on it, started it, and he said he couldn't have driven any straighter for that pecan tree than if you'd have painted a white line on the ground for him to follow. And said my grandfather just stood there and watched him, and sure enough, over he went. Said my grandfather never said a word. He just looked down at the ground and shook his head, reached over and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, they just ain't like us." The same thing can be said to be true between us and Northerners or the Yankees in particular. They just ain't like us. And over the years I've heard a lot of explanations for why that's true, but those 6 little words to me encapsulated an awful lot of wisdom about an awful lot of things. But to get a little more analytical, just to understand, get a little bit deeper understanding of why that difference exists, again, I'd like to refer to Richard Weaver and from his essay, The South and the American Union, because he described to me what is the essence of the difference between us and them. And he described the Southerner as a classical man, somebody who had stayed wedded to the idea of classical liberalism in government with its fixed limits on power, that a man who knows nothing of infinite progressions but wants fixed limits in all things. He rejects the idea of restless striving just for the sake of striving in favor of a permanent settlement. He wants a coming to terms with nature, and he recognizes a world of coexistent individual things. He's tolerant by nature in that he knows other things are because they have to be. He learns to mark their nature and their limits and how to get along with them. He accepts a certain amount of irremediability and evil in the world, or irremediable evil in the world, and that it's better to fence it in rather than to stomp on it and spread it everywhere. Now, he contrasted this worldview with the Yankee mindset, and he classified the Yankee mindset as Faustian. And the Faustian mind is one that is a restless striver, a yearner after the infinite, a hater of stasis, someone who is unhappy unless he feels he is making the world over. He may talk much of tolerance, but for him, tolerance is an exponent of power. And his tolerance tolerates only the dogmatic idea of tolerance, which anyone can come to learn by getting to know the modern humanitarian liberal. For other ideas and ways of life, he has not respect, but in a hostility or contemptuous indifference until the day arrives that those other ways can be brought into conformance with his own. Now, H.L. Mencken, the famous social commentator from the early 20th century, he described it a little more succinctly. He said that the Yankee mindset was one that was gripped by the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. Now, since 1865, this Yankee mindset and worldview is what has been presented to the outside world as the American mindset and worldview. It is the mindset and worldview that owns, controls, and runs the U.S. regime. There's really no way to argue around that. If you look at the presidential election maps from 1860 until today, and Michael already showed a little bit of this in his presentation, you see an amazing consistency from election cycle to election cycle. The South has always voted as a bloc for what it perceives, and I emphasize the word perceives, to be the traditional conservative political viewpoint. You can also look at polling data. Again, Michael pointed some of this out. Poll after poll after poll. If you look at the way Southern people respond to different questions on social and political issues, it's very solid and very antithetical to the rest of the country. And even our scallywag and transplant politicians that say they represent us in Congress, more often than not, vote the will of the Southern people on those kinds of issues. The problem is the one that John C. Calhoun pointed out: king numbers. Every once in a while they may get something right and actually vote to represent the dearest interest of the Southern people. The problem is mathematical. The others always outvote us. There are more of them. And because our two mindsets and worldviews are completely diametrical to one another, they are always going to outvote us, and our dearest rights and interests are always going to be trampled under their feet. So when I'm talking about, when I mention this to people, I ask them, look, let's play a little game here for just a minute. Let's imagine for a moment that the South is an independent republic. Now ask yourself a few questions about policies and issues in that free and independent republic versus what they are and how they're imposed upon us by the others by virtue of our being pinned to the United States with bloody bayonets. If the South were free and self-governing according to her own principles and her own worldview, would we even be discussing abortion, sodomy, gun control, regulation or confiscation, women and homosexuals in the military, uncontrolled third world immigration, the police spy state apparatus? Would we be constantly invading other countries for nation building and spreading democracy? Would we be, which is nothing more than imperialism? Would we be telling people that they couldn't pray at public functions or have a display of the manger scene on the courthouse lawn at Christmas time? Well, the answer to all of those questions would be a resounding no! Of course we wouldn't be talking, not the way we do now. It might be a little tabletop conversation, but it wouldn't even be on the radar screen from a political standpoint. But yet, by virtue of being a forced part of the United States of America, these kinds of abominations are shoved down our throat day after day after day, and we can't stop it. Why? Because they outvote us.
Right.
The rest of America and the world races to embrace socialism, atheism, and of course eventually nihilism. And despite a certain amount of pressure from without and some treason from within, the South still, to a large degree, even today, holds on to her Western Christian civilization. You could even go so far as to say that compared especially to the rest of the U.S. and even more so when you look at the rest of the world, that the South could very reasonably be called the last bastion of Western Christian civilization on the face of the earth. So, what did we do? What are some of the tactics and strategies that we in the league use to defend that Southern civilization? Well, one of the first things that we do, it's high on our list of things that we like to do, is to do what we call delegitimate the empire. We have to work with our people to begin to get them to recognize just how illegitimate and corrupt and evil the U.S. regime really is, so that they will finally reach a point where they no longer desire an association with it. And all of the recent scandals that have been coming out of Washington, D.C. over the last month or two. I mean, take your pick. Benghazi, the NSA spying thing, the stealing phone records, the suing the press, the IRS, all of this kind of stuff. And it just infuriates me to no end to watch the so-called conservative talking heads on television who may give lip service to the idea that, this is probably not a good thing, but as long as it doesn't go too far. Like Bill O'Reilly said the other night, he says, well, the spying thing, getting the phone records and all, it's okay because they had judicial oversight. Congress passed it, President signed it, and the courts upheld it, so it's okay. Now, this is how these so-called conservatives that a lot of our Southern brethren are out there listening to and imbibing their stuff every day. This is how they think about this stuff. Well, the police state's all right just as long as it doesn't go too far. What we have to make our people realize, and I have this conversation with a lot of my fellow Southerners. When we talk about the political situation, they'll say, They're doing this, that, or the other up there. How can they be that stupid to do this or to do that? How could they be so stupid? And what I always tell everybody who says that to me is, you're thinking about this all wrong. These people are not stupid. The people who own and control the U.S. regime are some of the smartest people on the face of the earth. They're like master chess players. They're always 6 or 7 moves ahead of whatever you're seeing on the news tonight. All of this is planned and orchestrated very well. So what you have to make yourself realize is that it's not stupidity, it's that they are evil to the marrow of their stinking bones.
Amen.
Once you make yourself realize that, once you wipe that stupid Star-Spangled Fairy dust out of your eyes and quit looking through those rose-colored U.S. flag glasses and realize that these people are evil, you will not be surprised by what they do anymore. It will be painfully obvious to you why they do what they do. Another part of delegitimating the empire is you have to demonize the symbols of the empire. You have to demonize that striped Yankee rag.
Right.
And to me, a statement that was made by Admiral Raphael Sims of the Confederate States Navy in his memoirs of Service Afloat describes very well the way we as Southerners should view the Yankee rag. He started out by saying that it was once the hallowed symbol of the principle that all just governments rest upon the consent of the governed. The principle that was vindicated by our ancestors in the revolution against Britain. And that it was difficult to realize that it no longer represented that principle, but had come to be the emblem of its exact opposite. That of coercing unwilling states to remain under a government that they had deemed unjust and oppressive. And he concluded by saying that many bearded men were affected almost to tears as that once hallowed emblem was hauled down from the flagstaves of Southern forts and arsenals. And he said they were in a condition of one who had to realize, in spite of himself, the perfidy of a friend and be obliged to give him up as no longer worthy of his confidence or affection.
Hear, hear.
As my friend Donnie Kennedy from Louisiana likes to say, when a Southerner looks at the U.S. flag, what he should see is prison bars. We also have to condemn the American civic religion, which my friend and fellow league member, or former league member, Franklin Sanders called Americanity. And believe you me, it's a pagan religion, as Mr. Singh very aptly pointed out, complete with idol worship and all the ceremony that goes along with idol worship. And like every other religion, it has its theology, it has its high priests, and its acolytes, and its ceremonies that everyone is expected to participate in. And they've done their job very well. In a recent poll that I saw among, for me this one's a little personal, being a Roman Catholic, this was a poll taken among American Catholics. And the question was, do they consider themselves a Catholic first or an American first? And I was extremely disappointed to read that 80% of Catholics in America consider themselves Americans first and Catholics second. It's exactly the opposite of what it should be. As a matter of fact, it should be 100% Catholic. And it's not, and unfortunately this phenomenon is not restricted just to the Catholic Church. The part of Alabama where I live is predominantly Protestant. And almost every church I drive by has a U.S. flag flying in front of it.
Yeah. Nope.
They have their patriotic celebrations on the 4th of July. They stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And they sing Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah.
So it's infected the entire corpus of Christianity in this country. So we have to point this out to our people and get them to reject Americanity and go back to practicing the Christianity that they profess to adhere to. Now, it's not easy to do this because of a little thing that psychologists define as cognitive dissonance. And the definition of cognitive dissonance is the confusion and stress that's created within a person because he tries to hold two conflicting beliefs at the same time. How many Southerners do you run across in your day-to-day activities in life who profess to be proud Southerners, who are glad that, proud to be from the South because of our manners and our good-natured ways and all the other things that make being a Southerner so wonderful? But at the first sign of somebody waving that Yankee rag, oh, they slap their hand over their heart and the big old tears start running. Oh, it's such a free country. It's the best country in the world and we're so free. How do you get through to somebody like that? How can you be proud to be a Southerner and all that represents, and then turn around and sing the praises of its exact opposite? It just makes no sense. But as Mr. Singh's presentation again pointed out, this is the effect of the brainwashing that we've all experienced at one time or another. They wave the magic talisman in front of us, and we give the appropriate Pavlovian response. And if they wave it in front of us long enough and hard enough, we give the appropriate Toby Keithian response. We're going to put a boot in somebody's butt. So we've got to, again, we must help our people recognize these things and begin to overcome them. They've got to see through to the truth of what the U.S. empire really is. And understand that if we want to have any chance at liberty and independence and maintaining our civilization, we have to separate ourselves from it. Another wonderful description of that mentality, that mental problem, if you will, that I saw was from a French Catholic bishop named Jacques Bossuet, who lived in the 17th century. And he said, the greatest derangement of the spirit is to believe something because we want it to be that way, and not because we have actually seen it for what it really is. And when you think about most of our Southern brethren, our uninitiated Southern brethren out there, that's where they are. They look at the U.S. and they believe the myth and the propaganda that they've been fed. They want to believe that the U.S. regime is the guy, the cowboy with the white hat riding in to save the day. That it represents mom and apple pie and everything, baseball and everything wonderful about the world. They haven't seen it for what it really is. And we have to try to find a way to help them do that. The other stumbling block in this that dovetails with that is just the old-fashioned capital sin of pride. The average person does not like to think himself to be a fool.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard when you point these things out to people. It's very difficult for them to get over that hurdle of pride and say, they've made a fool out of me my whole life. I've believed a lie, a colossal lie, my whole life. And for most people, they don't want to think they're that stupid and that foolish and that gullible. And so it's easier and less painful just to keep believing the myth, to just stick your head in the sand and go on about their business like everything's hunky-dory, rather than making that painful admission for a moment in time, but then at least afterwards being able to say, well, you know, they made a fool out of me this long, they're not going to make a fool out of me anymore. We have to help educate our people to have, once again, to have pride in their Southern culture and heritage. And want to see their civilization preserved. Everything that they hear coming from the powers that be tells them that we're backwards, we're slow, we're a stumbling block, we're ignorant, we're racist. You think of you name your epithet, and that's what they throw at us. We have to break out of that mentality of being second-class citizens in the Union. Let's not follow the early example of the Scots and Irish under the British. Let's not continue to be the Yankee regime's best hired mercenaries. I've heard it said that somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65% of the U.S. military is made up of Southerners. Why? As Southerners, we should resolve to never again go anywhere in the world and fight and die for anybody else's liberty and independence but our own.
Right. Amen.
And so we have to reject the idea, again, because of these differences in mindset and worldview. Our people have got to come to see themselves not as Americans, but as Southerners. We have to cultivate an us versus them mentality with our people. People ask me what I am in that regard. I say, I'm a Southerner. Because like Michael pointed out earlier, what's an American? You know, according to the powers that be that run the regime, an American is just anybody that happens to be alive anywhere in the world that can be taxed by the U.S. government. But for us as Southerners, it means something much more substantial than that. It means an ethnic group. It means a culture. It means things much more important than just being a nondescript taxable Homo sapien. Being a Southerner means something real and tangible. Being an American doesn't mean anything. Now, part of what this league has done for years, as I've already alluded to, is work on education. And for a long time, that educational effort has mostly been academic, up until just the last few years. If you've been coming to any of the league national conferences over the last few years versus the ones you went to prior to that, you've noticed a shift away from a lot of good educational, historical, political oratory to much more practical information that is going to help our people to survive the coming hard times that we're in for. So we've been working with people in the league have been working on doing a lot of workshops and laying the groundwork and so forth for helping people to learn how to get back to the land how to raise a garden, how to can and preserve your food, firearms safety and instruction. One thing that's real popular with a lot of the men league members right now, and it really should be with a lot of our ladies too, are the Jack Henson rifle shooting clinics that we've been sponsoring throughout Georgia. We had one in Alabama recently. And, you know, I grew up with guns, hunted and shot all my life, and I thought I knew a pretty good bit about how to shoot. But after I'd been there for a day, I realized that I didn't know as much about shooting as I thought I did. Again, just a lot of good practical stuff that our people can use to help weather the coming hard times. We also talk about the fact that we've got to get back to the old-fashioned Southern idea of community again. The Yankee Empire has isolated all of us in our living rooms in front of our television sets. And sadly to say, most of us don't even know who our neighbors are anymore. And so we've been trying to promote the idea of get to know your neighbors, talk to them about these kind of issues. You know, especially with this police state stuff, self-defense and community defense is becoming a very important issue. Get together and talk about how you're going to work together when they come to take your guns away. What are you going to do? Do you have a plan? How's everybody going to communicate? Does everybody know where to go, what to do? So those are some of the things that we're helping people to learn how to do as well. The last, I guess, and one of the most important things I think we need to do also, and this has already been alluded to by the other speakers as well, we must disabuse our people of the delusional notion that the empire can be reformed. Because that is a fool's errand. And the reason it's a fool's errand is because the system is wholly owned and controlled by a cabal of people that has it in their best vested interest to make sure that none of us has anything to say about it. Stop and think about it for just a little bit. We're really only given the illusion of participating in the system. But here again, what's the mantra? What's the trigger? Vote. Go vote. Make your voice heard. Participate in the system. Work within the system to change the system if you don't like it. If something's bothering you, work within the system. You know, elect a candidate that will represent your interests and so on and so forth. Well, what's the problem with that? Because, as it's already been pointed out, we have election after election after election after election. Nothing gets better. It only gets worse. How can that be? Well, number one, voting doesn't count. Your vote is meaningless. Joseph Stalin once said that those who vote determine nothing. Those who count the votes determine everything.
Yep.
Now, in the age of electronic voting, and I've seen a documentary about this where a computer expert testified before a congressional committee, for whatever good that does, who guards the guards. And he was asked a direct question: is it possible to write a computer program that can rig an election? Yes.
We had a county in Florida that had 141% voter participation.
There you go.
It went heavily for Obama.
So, riddle me this. How many of you think, in the age of electronic voting, that we've had an honest election? Chances are probably slim to none, right? I mean, you know, paper ballots are not infallible, but at least you can stand over people's shoulder and watch what they're doing, and somebody has to count so many votes for this guy and so many for this guy, and then somebody else sitting next to him's got to double check it. So at least there's a better chance of having an honest election that way, even though it's slower. But okay, hey, no big deal. You know, we Southerners like a slower pace of life. I don't care if it takes 2 weeks to get the election returns. I don't have to know before I go to bed that night who won. The other thing is that because the system is wholly owned and controlled by an elite group of people, the cold hard reality is that especially at the federal level and to a lesser extent at the state level, no one is even allowed to run for office that has not been handpicked, groomed, and vetted by the powers that be to play ball. That's why nothing ever changes from election cycle to election cycle, folks. You're exchanging Tweedledum for Tweedledee. That's all you're doing. They will not allow any meaningful opposition to be broached within the system. And every once in a while, a Ron Paul will slip through the cracks. But the 2 times he ran for president of the Yankee Empire, does anybody remember what happened to him and how he was treated by the media and by the powers that be that run the regime? Yeah, he was ignored. He was demonized. He was marginalized. I remember watching one of the so-called presidential debates one time that he actually got invited to. Oh, wonder of wonders. And I couldn't help but notice how the camera always conveniently kept him just out of frame. And how the moderator conveniently never asked him questions about anything or allowed him to offer a rebuttal comment to something that one of the other candidates had said. It's ridiculous. So you're banging your head against the proverbial concrete block wall over here, folks, if you think you're going to change the system. They don't want you to change it. I like to use an analogy. It's not a perfect one, but I like to use it anyway, about how to describe the ownership of the regime and how you don't have any say-so in what goes on with it. Just think of the U.S. regime as a Las Vegas gambling casino. The people who really own it and control it are always behind the scenes. The ever-present eye in the sky, as they call it in the gambling business. They're always watching. They're the ones who own they're the ones who own the show. They're the ones who run the show. They're the ones who rig all the games to make sure they win. And all of the rubes who think they can game the system come in there day after day thinking they're going to beat the odds and win a big jackpot from the house. And they're not going to do it. Think of it further this way. Just consider that the slot machines are Congress. The blackjack table is the presidency, and the crap table is the Supreme Court. Now, do you really think that the eye in the sky is going to let Joe Blow walk in off the street and take the back off of one of those slot machines and reprogram it where it'll pay out 10 times more than it's supposed to? Or get rid of that rigged paradise at the crap table? No. Ain't going to happen. And it ain't going to happen with the Yankee regime either. They're not going to let you tinker with their slot machines. And the worst of all for me would elect good conservative Republicans. This one makes me sicker than anything. I'm like, do you not know your history at all? Do I have to remind you that those are the people who mustered an army 152 years ago and marched it down here to take our free country away from us? 150 years ago today, my great-great-grandfather and my great-great-uncle were hunkered down in a bunker in Vicksburg eating rats and mules, fighting those people. What makes you think they're our friends? Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do. I mean, and how conservative are they in reality? I mean, the only way you can classify them as conservative is that they are good at conserving all the radical innovations that have been forced upon them by their so-called enemies.
Yeah.
They're real good at standing up for the Voting Rights Act and civil rights and affirmative action and welfare and Social Security and forced integration and the income tax and the Federal Reserve, etc., etc., ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Who needs that kind of conservatism? I mean, these are going to be our saviors? People like Ronald, I'll abolish the Department of Education, Reagan? People like Newt, contract with America, Gingrich? People like George, 1,000 points of light, New World Order, Bush? Or his son, George, hey, I think I want me one of them Gestapos like the Nazis had. Who gave us the Patriot Act and all that wonderful security at the airports? Or people like Marco, a third world immigrant, and every pot Rubio?
Yeah.
These are the people that are going to save the South? These people have thrown the South under the bus, folks. They've already declared war on you. They said, we don't care about you. They're going to pander to the third world immigrants. They're going to pander to everything else except what you hold dear. Why vote for these people? We should despise and abjure them. When we meet them on the street, we should spit at their feet. They shouldn't be accepted in polite Southern company.
That's right.
But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, for just a moment, that it would be possible to reform the Yankee Empire. That somehow, some way, in some galaxy far, far away, we might be able to reform the U.S. regime back to some semblance of what it was envisioned to be by the Founding Fathers, and what was fought with blood and treasure by our Confederate ancestors to maintain for themselves in the 1860s. Let's assume that we could do that. Well, my first question is, why? What is the advantage for Southerners to remain united with those people under that system? Because if anything, I think Mike Crane, one of our other board members of the league, has made a very good point and impressed it upon me to the point where I finally relented and saw the truth. We have to admit that the Constitution of 1787 is an abject failure. It had too many ticking time bombs and trapdoors in it. It left too many important issues unresolved. And sadly, some of them were settled by blood and iron, not only to our detriment, but to everybody on this continent's detriment. And unfortunately, even people on other continents around the world. So even if it could go back to the Constitution of 1787, the problem still remains that we will always be outvoted.
Yep.
Independence, Southern independence, a free and prosperous republic of our own, according to our own principles and our own worldview, is the only sane solution to this problem.
That's right.
All else is wasted time and energy. Secession and independence fixes everything. Our survival as a people depends on it.
Yep.
And in closing, I want to leave you with a thought that was penned by another famous fire eater from Virginia, a man named Edmund Ruffin. And this was from a note he wrote just before he shot himself in despair because the war had been lost. But his note read, in part, as follows: I hereby declare my hatred to Yankee rule, to all political, social, and business connections with the Yankees, and to the Yankee race. Would that I could impress these sentiments in their full force on every living Southerner, and bequeath them to everyone yet to be born. May such sentiments be held universally in the outraged and downtrodden South. Indeed, indeed, may such sentiments be held universally in the downtrodden South. And as General Robert E. Lee prayed, may God grant us a name and place among the nations of the earth. God save the South, and thank you very much.